I'm super excited about what I want us to cover today.
Okay.
Because since this conversation happened for me personally, I've
Mhm.
been very interested in hearing kind of your professional take
Okay.
on therapy, really, is what it's about. And
Yeah.
everyone knows I'm a huge advocate for therapy, but really the only viewpoint I have is that I've done it myself, and I've seen what
Right.
it can do for me, what it can do for other people. Um, but this was just kind of an interesting situation. So the backstory is a friend of mine called. She's really concerned about one of her very good friends and basically asked me, how do I get her to go to therapy? And I was like, well, it's not really
Yeah.
how it works. So, I mean, it's not your child. You're not going to like force them into class, right? But I think, and she clearly knows that, but it was more of a like, I think she was looking for
Like, she wants
something
to
to,
help.
yeah, like, yes, 100% wants to help her. And it's like, how do I get her to realize she needs this type thing?
Mm.
Um, and while I am a big advocate for therapy, I also feel that somebody has, and I don't know, I might be wrong on this, but I do think someone has to want it for themselves. Like maybe you can convince them, but I feel like if they're super closed minded to it, that it's going to be very hard to get them to continue regardless.
Mhm.
I don't know, maybe like the first step is just getting them to go to one session and then reevaluate. But what the advice I gave her, coming from, not a psychology
Mhm.
background, was really just like she has to want to fix her problems, but she also needs to understand that therapy doesn't necessarily fix you. So I guess she had
Mm.
tried it before, and her reasoning for not wanting to do it again was it didn't work for me. And I feel
Sure.
like I've heard that so many times, and I'm sure you have too. Like
Yeah,
I'm sure it's
absolutely.
just a constant like, obstacle you hear with therapy. Like I tried it, it
Absolutely.
didn't work. And I think we can unpack that
Mhm.
in itself. Um, but to finish kind of where we went with that, I kind of told her the way I explained it was therapy isn't meant to fix you.
Mhm.
It's just meant to learn yourself, learn what
Mhm.
your triggers are, and triggers might not be the word, but where those things that, make you anxious or make
Mhm.
you revert to an addiction or whatever you struggle with,
Sure.
it's just to give you tools, um,
Yes.
to help you grow from them and learn from them and react differently so you don't end up in this vicious cycle of I'm doing okay and then we're down the same slope again, or I'm doing okay
Mhm.
and I'm down the same slope.
Mhm.
And I kind of told her, like, if you wait till your engine explodes to get your car serviced, like
It's too
it's
late.
too late. Yeah, right. So what if we took our car for maintenance? We go to
Yeah.
therapy and we may not feel like we need it in the moment. Like I definitely go through my phases where I feel like I don't really need to talk to my therapist. Like I'm doing great. But then it
Mhm.
all implodes, right? But if I'm
Mhm.
seeing her consistently and maybe not as frequently, like maybe when I'm not in a
Right.
set hard season, I only see her once a month as opposed to every week or every other week.
Right.
But just keeping that in the front of my mind and focusing on, like looking into myself and realizing when those emotions are starting to come up and things like that, how
Mhm.
to deal with them. And that's, I don't know. My advice to her was basically like, to me, my answer would be all you can really do is try to reframe how she thinks about therapy
Mhm.
and then see if maybe she's willing to give it another go.
Mhm. Oh, I completely agree, and I think to your point, it's actually the most common thing that we hear. Therapy doesn't work. Why can't I just talk to a friend? Why
Mhm.
can't I just talk to a parent? Or I don't want to talk to a stranger. And so it's really important to be mindful that the entry point to therapy is different for everyone. So some people have the complete opposite experience where they love therapy and or the first time they went it worked, or maybe they've had enough people in their life with positive experiences that they're not apprehensive about it.
Mhm.
So I think the first thing I would say is it's okay if it feels awkward or uncertain, this idea of doing therapy, because initially you're talking to a stranger
Yeah.
and you're stepping into a really vulnerable space. And so for anyone who has either done therapy, maybe you're reminiscing and you're like, yeah, it's kind of weird the first time I met my therapist. Or if you've never gone to therapy, to know that that is completely normal to feel whatever comes up for you as you're approaching therapy. The most profound thing that happens in therapy, though, is you build this really beautiful relationship. And I am currently in the fall semester at my university. And so I'm teaching the therapy course to our future psych nurse practitioner students. And it's my favorite course. Yesterday, I went 1 minute over, which is like the worst thing to do on the first day of class, like, sorry guys, this stuff is so important and it's so magical, and they're like,
I
please
want to
let
go
us go home. Yeah.
home.
But, you know, the more that you practice therapy as a provider and the more people you see developing insight into their own life. So being able to reflect, self reflect and better understand the way that they think and they feel. And the more people you see who need you less, to your point, right? You don't need therapy is not a forever thing. It could be seasonal. You go into maintenance, you can graduate and no longer need it. But it's definitely a tool that is underutilized right now in, I would say globally, but definitely in America. And my favorite data point that I always talk about is 50% of the positive outcomes in therapy are dependent on the relationship between the therapist and the client. And so that's really important that you feel that you're seeing someone who's trustworthy, that gets you,
Yeah.
and that you can talk to authentically.
Yeah.
And so that's also where it's like, if we just think about relationships, not every single person you meet is your friend
Yeah.
or someone you'd want to be friends with. So
Mhm.
it's
You don't
kind
click.
of normal that you may not click with a therapist right away. And that
Yeah.
doesn't mean therapy's bad.
Yeah. So, okay, I guess, do you have a suggestion for someone? Because I also try to look at this as like people have different personalities. I'm
Mhm.
very extroverted in most situations. I'm also very willing to talk about things, but part of that is because of therapy, like
Mhm.
learning myself. But for somebody who would struggle, we had just addressed like, okay, so you mentioned, oh, people say like, well, I have friends I can talk to, whatever.
Right.
When there's somebody who is not even willing to talk to a friend,
Mhm.
or say they have had a bad experience, or how do they find, like, I don't know, should people be like interviewing therapists? And is that even really a thing? Like, do a
Oh,
first session but how
so
are they? I think there's even just entry issues, like people being able to
yeah,
get into the provider is taking so long.
that's okay. So I think there's two questions there. Number one, what is a provider's availability? Can you afford them?
Yeah.
Do they take your insurance? Those are really important questions to ask someone. And also, what is the type of therapy they provide? And there are many, many, many therapists and clinics or practices that do an initial phone call, whether that's directly
Okay.
with your therapist or maybe
Yeah.
with an administrator. So you can ask those questions. Some therapists even have, a bio on their website that might say what to expect at the first visit. But I would say, yes, it is completely appropriate to have your questions answered and feel like you're walking into something that's a little bit predictable because you don't
Yeah.
want to sign up for something if it's outside of your budget and or scheduling feasibility.
Yeah.
Because here's the biggest risk factor with therapy. And interestingly, I had a friend reach out to me yesterday who's been doing a form of therapy that requires a specific scheduled frequency.
Okay.
And she just reached out to say, hey, just thinking of you. I'm going through the therapy process and it's a lot of work. Like, will you keep me in your thoughts and prayers? Like, I'm doing the work. I'm grateful that I'm doing it, but it's kind of heavy right now.
Yeah.
And I was like, absolutely. And I'm so proud of you. And it is work. And so that's the difference of friendship, right? When we're in a friendship conversation, it's two ways. Um, there's a lot of shared experiences and or there's not this expectation that like I have to do anything for you or you have to do anything for me. Therapy is one directional and the therapist's job is to support you doing the work that you need to do in your own life. And so that might look like emotional work, it might look like some cognitive or thought work where we're shifting some of the ways that you're thinking.
Hmm.
It might look like honestly that combination of thoughts and emotions
Yeah.
where we are intentionally carving time out and especially under this umbrella of grief where we're saying, hey, today, how do you feel about revisiting this part of your story?
Hmm.
And I'll add this disclaimer there. You don't have to do therapy outside of the therapy office. So I think that's the other piece that's really powerful is therapy helps our brain compartmentalize hard stuff.
Mm.
So it's hard work, but it also allows us to start putting some of that stuff in a place that we leave it. And we can tell ourselves, like if you're out living your life and grief is coming up and or just some thoughts that are disrupting your day, to be able to say, oh, you know, I'm going to talk about that with my therapist next Tuesday. You
Yeah.
know what I'm saying? Like we can start
That's such a
parking
good point,
things.
and it is, speaking from experience, so true. Like, unknowingly, I've done that so many times.
Yeah. And that's life-giving. And so that's one of the things where it's like, yes, it's hard work. It
Mhm.
can be exhausting. However, that's how anything is, right? I don't
Yeah.
know anyone who runs and is like, you know what I love? The first mile. It's my favorite. It's like, or even like a warm up for, you know, sometimes people are really into their warm up routine, but most people are like, no, I do this exercise because I love the result and I like how I feel and I know it's giving me benefits for my overall health and my physique. But most people aren't like, you know what I love? Pain and suffering.
Yeah.
Like,
Sign me
and
up. How much
so
can I pay?
yeah. And so I think that's the challenge in life is sometimes we have emotional pain and or cognitive pain that we didn't choose. And then it's like popping up at times we don't want it to be there. And so when we start intentionally sitting in therapy and addressing it with someone who's trained to walk us through
Mhm.
in safe and healthy ways, we get back all this energy. And I work a lot with children and adolescents. And so I'll hear that from them where they're finding time to do other things or hobbies, and it's super fun.
Yeah, that's great.
It's a sign of healing, yeah.
Cool. Well, I know for me, therapy was, it was something like, I truly don't, no one had ever mentioned really therapy before. I mean, I was kind of forced into a few things when my dad died because I was, young, and they tried to put me with some counselors. I don't know if I'd even
Right.
call it therapy. Um, don't really even remember the experience other than the first time sitting down and being like, who are you? I'm not talking to you. I think
Yeah.
it was honestly the guidance counselor like at our school. And then a summer camp. But the when I first, for those that don't really know my story, after William died, so in September of 2020, my 17-year-old brother died by suicide.
Mhm.
And I was actually calling therapists to find a therapist for my family, for my mom, for my dad, and my brother. Not for me, because I didn't need it.
Yeah.
And I clicked with one of the therapists, to your point, where like some of them will take the initial phone call.
Yeah.
She was referred by a friend. She was in, I think, like a church group with a friend of mine. And
Yeah.
she was like, hey, she's a therapist. If you want to talk to her. And I called her just as one of my like, let me get informations. And I was like, I really liked her. Like, just instantly got
Mhm.
like I could have a conversation with you vibe.
Mhm.
Um, and fast forward almost 4 years later, she's still my therapist. Now I saw her weekly for a while, then bi-weekly, then sporadically. Now I see her kind of sporadically again.
Yeah.
I do try to stay a little proactive with it. If I know like I'm coming into a hard season,
Sure.
I schedule an appointment, even if I feel okay. But she just kind of became like, that's my person I go to. And
Mhm.
it worked out for me amazingly. But one of the things I was very surprised by is I went into it with this expectation of like, I need to figure out how to heal from this trauma, or
Mhm.
maybe not heal, but like I need to process this trauma. Like,
Sure.
who do I talk to about it? What do I do with it? How do I process it? And I would say in the immediate aftermath of that, like the kind of the family dynamics, my relationship dynamics, like it was hard for, Chris and I were both experiencing a loss in completely different ways,
Mhm.
and learning how each other were going to deal with that too. Like
Mhm.
he had to deal with me and me withdrawing from a lot of things and being a person that I wasn't normally. Like he had to learn a
Sure.
new person basically. Like
Yeah.
me in a trauma response is not the me he had known for the last 8, whatever, I can't math, but a lot of years, you
Yeah.
know? Um, and it was interesting because through therapy, it of course started with that focus on William. We talked a lot about that in the,
Mhm.
through that season and through the holidays. And then as we got farther away from those big events, then it kind of turned into how I actually just process things in general, how I respond
Mhm.
to things in general, how I
Yeah.
communicate, and what it, like an unintended side effect that was so great is it made, I think, our marriage so much better.
Yeah.
Chris also talked to her for a while, which I know
Mhm.
also some couples, like some therapists, I think won't even talk to a husband and a wife.
It depends on their training. Yes.
Okay. So, and she was like, look, I'm willing to. That's really up to you guys. Like, I will do it,
Mhm.
but that's you guys need to know that then I am kind of I might be hearing the two sides of things or whatever it
Right.
is. And but it really turned out great. And I think we also focused a lot, like of course we'd bring up relational things, but I think most of our focus was on kind of healing from the trauma and just dealing with
Mhm.
our own kind of like demons and
Yes.
struggles. Um, but we both learned a lot about ourselves and it made us so much stronger.
Mhm.
And when I look back at how our relationship was starting the turmoil after William, of like just
Mm.
not knowing how to deal with each other or
Right.
really him deal with me, like I was not okay. And
Right.
neither was he, but he hides it better.
Mhm.
And parenting our kids and all those things
Yeah.
when I was just trying to like keep my head above water
Mhm.
was like I think it probably saved us a lot of like heartache and
Mm.
who knows? But I mean, our relationship got so much stronger from something that I know could have easily torn it apart. Um,
Yeah.
and
And
I
I
feel
think
like you see that, right? Like you see
yeah.
relationships be torn apart over a trauma.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's where what comes to mind is our defense mechanisms. So every
Mhm.
single person has a neurobiological response that's gonna protect you and keep you alive. So your brain is wired to keep you alive, and we all have different ways that that shows up in our lives. So for some people, I think we've talked about this, one of yours is humor. Like, you are really great at just making a quick joke or moving through or,
Yeah.
um, and for some people, I mean, if you Google defense mechanisms, you'll there's plenty of them. So we're not gonna like exhaust that list, but it's important. And I think that's something we learn in therapy. Okay, what do I do in a stressful situation unconsciously? Is that serving me? Do I want to keep doing it? Could
Mhm.
I choose something else? And so what I'm hearing from you is not only did you have the opportunity to reflect, Chris also did. And then in your marriage, you were looking at, you know, some of the patterns that might unconsciously show up in seasons of stress. And yeah, whenever we build insight or awareness, whenever we can say, oh, that's what's happening, and approach it with curiosity, not shame, not blame, there's not something wrong, then we allow ourselves the opportunity to have compassion on ourselves and choose something different if we want. Sometimes
Mhm.
we reflect on something and we're like, I'm okay with that. That moves me through.
Yep.
I think a lot of women, and not to be overly generalistic, but I think a lot of women are very good at choosing other people over themselves,
Mhm.
right? Like you were looking for therapists for everyone in your family.
Mhm.
And that's kind of what we do. We take care of people. And that's kind of an example of a defense mechanism where we might not wanna turn that off, but we may wanna tamper it down where we're saying, "I can't exclude myself from the list." Like, I
Yeah.
can still take care of things, however, I have to include myself,
Yeah.
and I think that's the hardest piece for people to choose is themselves first. You are worthy of being cared for, and that should start with you as an individual, and a lot of times that's what starts to come up in therapy is where did you get this messaging in your life
Yeah.
that you're now choosing on your own, and it comes from all different places. And so, I mean, goodness, I could talk about this forever because I believe so strongly in individuals having the opportunity to know themselves and feel that agency over their lived experience. And yeah, that's where you see patterns repeat in an individual's life because you can continue to be surprised that the same thing keeps happening, or you can pause, schedule some time, whether that's by yourself or with a therapist, and reflect like, am I choosing this? Am I contributing to this?
Yeah.
And just an aside, healthy therapists also go to therapy. And so this is not a position of authority. It's not a position of knowing more or knowing it all. Absolutely not. Healthy therapists are continuously doing that process too. The self-reflection, the supervision, the accountability. And, that's foundational to the work, because as a therapist, you're diving into other people's stuff. And guess what that does?
Gets in your
Brings up
head.
your stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's important
You're
that you
still a
have that,
human.
yeah, that self-awareness. And I'll share from my experience. Goodness, it was probably 2018. I had a beautiful therapy session with a teenager, and it was a lot of fun. And she had some insights, and it was great. And we'd been working together for like 6 months, and she left my office, and I had this feeling of jealousy. I was like, I don't feel jealous. It's not something that I feel often.
Yeah.
And so it was very alarming, because I was like, what is this? And so I sat with it, did some reflection, spoke with one of my colleagues, and they were like, maybe you need to like go to therapy. And I was like, I need to go to therapy. So the point is, that was another entry point, like back into therapy,
Yeah.
to figure out what were the needs that I had that should be met, and what I was able to articulate over time, not right away.
Yeah.
But I was jealous that I was jealous of myself.
Like that she was cared for and you
Yes,
wanted
I'm like, who's doing
it
this?
makes
Who's
sense.
taking care of me? Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just share that to say most therapists, now they're not going to tell you that if they're your therapist, because it's a one way, but you can have my story because I'm not your therapist. But yeah, they will say, oh yeah, I'm in therapy, or I've done therapy, right? And we know we have guardrails and
Yeah.
professional obligations on when we go back.
Yeah.
And even in my current practice, we do weekly meetings as a team where we sit and we're doing case consultations, check-ins with each other, just to make sure we're in a healthy headspace to be with people and
Yeah.
take good care of them.
Yeah. I mean, you have a huge responsibility of a job that I feel like if you're mentally off one day, it's very hard to do your job. And if I think about how many days I'm mentally off, couldn't do your job. I would need daily therapy. So it would kudos to you. We're thankful for people like you because we need you.
Yeah, thank you. But
Awesome. Well, I know we
out there.
could just literally talk about it for hours. Like there's so much, but I think this is something we'll revisit, I'm sure, probably every
Yeah,
time we talk about anything. So, but I appreciate that insight. And I hope that, I mean, I guess my biggest thing when I'm digging into the awareness side or like advocating for therapy is that like you don't need a trauma.
right.
You don't need something terrible to
Yeah,
happen to you to like justify going to therapy.
no,
Like I think therapy is just, I think maybe a better way of looking at it is like just learn about yourself because
yeah,
there's nobody who won't benefit from knowing more, literally more about themselves, learning
right.
about their communication style. You think you know yourself until you go to therapy and you're like, oh, I didn't, where I didn't pick up on these things. And like all of us can improve somewhere. And
Correct.
I would give like if I could give somebody like a money back guarantee, like I'm telling you, if you truly commit to therapy,
Right.
you will reap nothing but benefits from it. Like
Yeah,
your relationships will benefit from it, your kids will benefit from it, your everybody around you. But I truly think you personally benefit the most because it calms a lot of things that probably used to like cause turmoil in you because
mhm,
you understand why you think or feel or do things that you do. Because as soon as
yeah,
I understood why I thought of things certain way and how and all of that, and I was just like, oh, this is just how I process it. And when I could explain those things to Chris, I didn't seem as crazy. I was just like, look, here's
yeah,
how my brain thinks of this. And like, I know you don't have ill intention and I know that you mean well, but like, here's how I
right.
process it. And I don't even have to say it out loud sometimes. I think, and I'm like, let me step back because before I get mad, I know how this looks to him and I know it's a me thing. Um,
I think that right there, Jen, where we become less attached to taking ownership. Because I
yeah.
think we all have different experiences in life when someone's saying, this is on you. Whether
Mhm,
that's like, I have to apologize, or I did something wrong, or now I'm in trouble. Like, we all
mhm.
have different reactions to that versus just owning, yeah, okay, that's how I show up in the world.
Yeah.
And doing life with other people means they may or may not like how I show up all the time. And it
Mhm.
doesn't mean I'm in trouble. It doesn't mean something's wrong. But sometimes we do need to take ownership of that so that we can have more peace in our relationships or more understanding.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really good example, just saying like that pause of like, wait a second, then move through, like after reflection. And most people don't do that. Most of us just go through our day and then we're like, I don't understand why that happened.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it helps. It's wild how many of kind of like, I don't even want to say the word is argument. I can't think of a specific example right now, but just something like would frustrate me. And it was just so once I learned how I think about things and why I think the way I do and the way I order things in my brain,
Mhm.
like one of those things. So we talked about, I guess a good way to visualize it to people is I discovered in therapy that I have like folders, like file folders, which is
Mhm.
awesome in real life because I'm crazy. But and I like fill a folder and then like that folder's done and then the next folder's open and like when folders are open, and you could do tabs on a computer, but the
Yeah.
folder thing for me is a better visualization because one of the things we talked about and why kind of like time and grief and healing,
Mm.
I felt like that folder that had William in it
Mm.
getting pushed farther back and farther back and farther back in that file box. And it was never going to be brought back to the front because it was
Mhm.
going to be reopened with new memories or new situations or whatever. And learning that like that's truly how my brain works in every single scenario,
Mm.
not only enabled me to start thinking of things differently because I know
Mm.
I do that, I can then change my thinking if it's a situation that that's not beneficial in, but also it helped me to understand why certain things, it wasn't necessarily how maybe Chris or anyone else in my life would say something to me, it was how I processed it. And
Correct.
when I could step back and think about that, I was like, okay, it's not a them thing, it's a me thing. And that's like my issue to work through,
Mhm.
not their problem.
Mhm.
And I mean, it just changes every facet of your life, relationships,
Yeah.
yourself, and it just makes it's a more peaceful way to live. I don't know,
More
like,
yeah. Well, and
I
I think what I would say to your friend who's thinking of a friend
mhm,
is all we can do is share our experiences with friends.
yep,
And if therapy has been a positive experience in your life, you can authentically share that.
yeah,
And if their experience has been negative, you can empathize. Like, man,
yeah,
that stinks. I'm so sorry you didn't see the right person that time.
yeah,
Maybe you'll find someone that you resonate with in the future.
mhm,
Um, but I understand that feeling of longing for someone to choose something that would be beneficial to them
yeah,
or that has been beneficial to you, where you're like, "Ah, I just wanna gift you this."
yes,
But the reality is when people are not ready, they're not ready.
mhm,
And so respecting that they're not ready actually is therapeutic. And one of our other faculty members shared yesterday that they 2 years ago had a patient, the parents were panicking, "Please help our child. We really, really want them to be in therapy right now." And that child came in, went through the whole process, and was just not interested. And the provider at the time, 2 years ago, respected that and just said, "I can see some areas we could work on. I hear you that you don't want to, but I want you to know when you're ready, I'll be here." And she said it was the hardest decision she'd made because it felt very counterintuitive.
mhm,
And she was saying to the parents, I think this is the right decision. 2 years later, that person is now old enough to schedule their own appointments, reached out to her like
oh,
last month and is in therapy. And what they shared was the fact that you respected where I was when I was younger made me believe that you would respect me. And you're the only person I've ever seen that did that.
wow, that's crazy.
And obviously, there were no huge glaring safety concerns. There was just some stuff for that person to work on. So I just share that to say, you know,
In due time.
timing is what
Everything.
matters.
Yeah,
And yeah, goodness of fit and the right time. And sometimes it might be a slow grow. Maybe you do that intake call. Maybe you schedule an intake and see someone monthly and see if you warm up.
yeah,
Um, yeah, but big fan of giving it a try if you've never tried it. And not waiting until there's a crisis. I love that you said that. You don't have to have a crisis and you don't have to have something specific to go to therapy for. You can
yeah,
just go to therapy because you want to learn about yourself. You don't even have to have a diagnosis. You just go to therapy to work on your self-esteem or your thought process or
Get the oil changed, then your engine doesn't explode.
yes,
That's all about.
100%. Yes, we don't want people exploding.
Oh, you're so open. So awesome. Well, thank you so much. I so appreciate
Yeah.
your time, and I just think it's such an important thing. So I'm sure we'll talk about it 100 times over.
Yes. Yes. So important. Well, thank you.
All right. Of course. Thank you.